Well, hey there, fellow adventurers. It's the Big Heavy, and if you can tell by the minor degree of chaos behind me, we're getting ready to head out on a family bicycle adventure. So we're going for about 6 days. We're riding the Great Allegheny Passage from Pittsburgh to Cumberland, Maryland. Fantastic Rails to Trail project on the East Coast. I think it's, at least they claim, it's one of the longest car-free bicycle paths in the United States. So definitely a great thing to check out if you're into bicycle adventures. But wanted to talk briefly about communications and how on my adventures I stay in touch both with family and friends that are back at their homes, as well as how we're planning on communicating with each other during this trip. So we're going on, as I mentioned, a bicycle adventure. There's 5 of us. We'll have 4 bikes. My little guy and I will be on the tandem. And I'm assuming that we're going to spread out a little bit. You know, something like a bicycle trip or even a backpacking type trip. Everyone kind of moves at slightly different paces and, you know, you're not going to be miles apart, but I'm assuming that during this trip, we may get, you know, up to half a mile, maybe a mile of distance between us. So there's a concern around how do we communicate in an emergency or just kind of generally stay in touch with folks back home, as well as how do we stay in touch with each other if we do get a little bit spread out during the course of our cycling. So I'll show you what I use, and I've got one kind of new trick up my sleeve that I'm going to test out on this trip, and then my more traditional stuff is something I'd bring either on a group type adventure or if I'm going solo. So first up in my bag of tricks is fairly obvious, and I won't show it to you because I'm using it to record myself right now, and that's a smartphone. Smartphones are great for both emergency communications, for text, photos, you know, all the stuff that you would use a smartphone for. The one place they hit a bit of a challenge during an adventure is sometimes you end up in an area with no service. I try and do a lot of stuff in the backcountry, up in the mountains of New England, some of the areas down in the southeast where we live, you'll end up with no cell service. So there's a concern about, you know, how do I both let people know that I'm doing well, as well as if I get into trouble, you know, how do I kind of call in the cavalry if something bad happens? Particularly if I'm solo or I'm out with just one of the kids, you know, if I fall down and break my leg, my 7-year-old or my 10-year-old probably aren't going to be able to haul my big old butt out of the woods. So having some sort of emergency backup is a nice thing. And that's where this guy comes into play. So this is the Garmin INREACH Mini 2. It's the newer Mini. Prior to this, I had the larger Garmin INREACH, the orange one. I think that was the second version that they came out with. But this guy does a few things for us. So first off, it has a feature where it'll track you, and it has a nice little map that's out on the internet. It's a little bit convoluted to use, but you can set it up so every 10 minutes it sends your position to this map. And that way, if I'm traveling out with the kids or I'm on a solo mission, my wife can kind of see where I am and know that I'm still moving and presumably alive. For the family trips, we send out a link to the map to the grandparents and relatives who are interested in what we're doing and, you know, also probably want to know that we're alive. So it has this kind of general ability to let people know where you are and that you're, you know, presumably alive and well. It also has two-way communications, which is pretty nice. You can essentially send text messages. You know, there's no images, there's no fancy stuff. It's kind of your good old 160 or 120-ish character kind of text messaging. And the device will connect to your phone via Bluetooth. So, you know, typing out a message using the 2 little up and down arrow keys on the side of this thing would obviously be an exercise in frustration. So you connect it up via Bluetooth. Even if your phone doesn't have a cellular signal, it should still be able to connect to this guy via Bluetooth. You can type in your messages, you know, send things pretty quickly. There is some latency, so this communicates via satellites. So, you know, you pump a message in here, it's got to go and find the satellite, shoot it up. You know, the satellite's got to do whatever it needs to do to get your message from space to the intended recipient. So it's not as instantaneous as when you're using a phone to send messages back and forth, but it works, it's effective, as long as you can kind of see the sky and you're not in a tunnel, you're not under a whole bunch of trees, it will work inside buildings. It will get you messages out into the world. With the Bluetooth feature, when I'm out on a bike trip or something like that, I'll try and leave this, you know, maybe in the saddlebag or something where it's got a little better view of the sky if I'm, you know, camped under a tree or something like that. And that Bluetooth functionality will work from 20, 30 feet away. And I can kind of tell the peeps back at home that I'm doing great. You know, here's what I saw. Here's kind of what went on in my adventure. So that's pretty cool. So you've got that ability to track yourself. You've got that ability to, you know, just sort of send general, hey, here's where I am. Here's what I'm doing. And then you also have this SOS button on the side. So this is kind of the call in the cavalry feature. I've never had to use it, thankfully, and there are some videos out there of people that have activated the SOS function, and they kind of contact the local authorities and hopefully get you out of a sticky situation. But I show my kids how to use that when I'm out with one of the kids in case something terrible happens to me that they can't help me mitigate, and we need to kind of call in for help and support. Now, next up is kind of the communications within our bicycle group. My assumption there is, we may get a little spread out. Somebody may be a quarter mile in front of me that wants to move a little faster. Maybe my 13-year-old wants to get out ahead a little bit, and if he's being kind to his sister, maybe she'll be tagging along. So I wanted an ability to be able to reach out and say, hey, I've got a flat. I'm kind of the caboose of our crazy train, so I'm the sweep vehicle. I've got all the repair stuff. So if I get stuck, I'm kind of going to be there by myself and would like to let people know that I'm a little running behind. Or if someone up ahead has a problem or something, they can call back and let me know. Not all of us have phones. My wife and I obviously have phones. My oldest, who's 13, recently got a phone. But again, if we're outside of cell coverage, or if my daughter has a problem and doesn't have a phone, it's not really a great way to reach us. And phones, frankly, aren't great for quick communication. If I want to say, hey gang, I've got a flat, please wait for me, having to get out the phone, having to figure out who I'm going to call and all that stuff is a little bit of nonsense. So two-way radios make a lot of sense in this scenario. And for this trip, we've all got these Retevis two-way radios. And I'll put links to all this stuff in the description. Obviously, this is a blatant Motorola talkabout knockoff. Frankly, I quite like Motorola radios. I would have bought Motorola radios for this. I think they have great sound. They have pretty great radio electronics, but their batteries invariably suck. I've had like 3 generations of Motorola talkabouts. They put these, I don't know if they're NiCad or nickel metal hydride batteries, but they take forever to charge. They don't hold a charge very well. They're constantly running out when you need them. So this guy has lithium ion batteries. He's theoretically got some degree of water resistance. So, I'm anticipating rain because every time I go out in the woods, it rains. And it also has a weather radio function. So, if we're off the grid, if we don't have cell coverage, we can listen to some localized weather and figure out what's going on. So I've, tested these around the house, but haven't brought them in an adventure context. So when I come back, I'll sort of review how all this stuff works. They do have lithium ion batteries. They are chargeable via USB-C, and they give you a little cable that plugs into a standard USB port and has 2 USB-Cs. So we have 4 radios all together because, again, I'm on a tandem with my little guy, so he didn't need his own radio. And I think that charging cable, that Y cable, will be nice since we'll be able to split and charge 4 radios with only 2 USB outlets, since we don't have a ton of charging ability since we're traveling light via bikes. Now, the final comms tool we're bringing, this is kind of totally an experimental, sciencey project type thing. The INREACH is obviously a commercial product. The Retevis radios are obviously a commercial product. I'm interested to see how they work versus something like a Motorola. This is an absolute science project. And if you're saying, hey, that thing looks a little goofy and looks like a janky 3D printed case, you would be 100% correct. So this is what's called a MESHTASTIC radio in there. There's a little circuit board that I got off of AliExpress that uses, I think it's called LoRa, L-O-R-A. It's like low-powered radio something or other. It's essentially a data-centric, low-powered radio standard. And it operates an unlicensed radio spectrum. And if all these things I'm saying don't mean anything to you, interpret this as, hey, this is something interesting that might be commercially viable in a little bit. You can kind of safely ignore it for your own adventures. If you're a radio or electronics nerd, maybe this is something that you'd be interested and want to try yourself. But you essentially can buy these radio boards. They're like $10 each. They come over from China on literally the slow boats. They take 4 to 6 weeks to get there. You buy your own lithium ion battery, which is this little hump in the back. You've got to solder this little screen here onto the guy. There's 3D printed buttons. There's a little mini USB so you can charge this guy up. But what it does is it has a GPS radio in here as well as this LoRa radio. So it gets your position and then it sends it out via a mesh radio network. And what that means is each of us will have one of these guys in our handlebar bag. And if I'm the caboose in our crazy bicycle train, it'll send out my position. And if the person at the lead-off rider is too far away, the person in front of me will get that signal and it'll kind of hop it over to the next in line. So that's that mesh technology, and that's not exclusive to this. Mesh radios have been around for a little while, but essentially it uses each radio as both a receiver and a transmitter. So it allows your network to kind of extend itself. So if we're, spread out over the course of the mile, this little radio in here might not be able to get a mile of range, but it could get the quarter mile to the next person ahead of me, who then, gets a quarter mile jump to the next person, who gets that quarter mile jump to the next person. And it's able to cover a wider range that way. Now, the reason I'm bringing these along is, aside from experimentation and to see how they work, and, just because I like radios and I'm nerdy like that, theoretically, this should let us see all of our positions without needing any sort of cellular or network coverage. So my wife and I have an app on our phones. There's a MESHTASTIC app. All this stuff is free. And again, it's kind of a science project. You got to do firmware upgrades and goof around with all this stuff. So I think there are some companies that are looking to commercialize this. So this may be kind of coming soon to a Best Buy or whatever near you. But at this point, it's sort of a science project. But my wife and I each have the MESHTASTIC app, and it'll show a little dot with the position of each of the radios. And I think it sends out a signal every 4 or 5 minutes. So theoretically, again, if I'm in that situation where I get a flat and I need to stop, I can get in the radio and say, hey everyone, I got a flat, hold up. I can open up that MESHTASTIC app, and regardless of whether we have cell service or not, I can see where everyone is on the trail. Or if, my son, who's our lead rider or whatever, or whoever's up in front of our crazy train, says, hey, I have a flat, or I fell and I hurt myself, or, can you guys come and help me? I can quickly glance at that MESHTASTIC app, see how far away they are, and, have an idea of their location when I go up to, bring the repair kit and kind of bring the cavalry. I've goofed around with these a little bit kind of around home. I've taken a walk or given one to one of the kids and told them to ride down the street, and it seems to work. I haven't done tons of range testing or anything like that. So I'm not relying on these for our trip. It's not kind of a part of my critical communications infrastructure, so to speak. But I'm sort of interested in seeing how these things work, and I'll do a full report once we get back and kind of let you know how all our multi-layered communications approach ended up working out in the field. So finally, I want to leave you with a few tips as you're planning out communications for your own adventures. I think don't rely on cell phones. If you are going somewhere that maybe you've been before, you're 100% sure there's cell service, everything's great. Maybe you feel okay just kind of rolling with your cell phone. If I'm traveling solo and, I'm pretty sure there's reliable cell service, I'm, probably the most expendable member of the family. I'm, well insured, so I might risk it. But if I'm going with my kids, I want some sort of backup layer. And something like this INREACH, I'm a huge fan of. It's expensive. These things are a couple or $300 a piece. The service is pretty expensive. I think it's between 20 and 60 or $70, depending on the features that you get with the service. The big variable is how many text messages you're able to send. But you can turn the service on and off on a month-to-month basis. So I'll turn it off for the winters. I generally have it running kind of during the summer adventuring months. And it's, at the end of the day, somewhat cheap insurance. If I fall down and bust myself and I'm with my 7-year-old and we're, 10 miles into a trail, he's not going to be able to lug my big old butt out of there. He might get worried or confused. And now he's got an ability to kind of summon some help. I do like Garmin stuff quite a bit. I think if Garmin put their logo on a dried dog turd and told me that it would somehow make my adventures more awesome or help me with my health and fitness, I'd give them a couple or $300 for it. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but I think they make good stuff, and all their stuff tends to work together. So that InReach device will connect to my Garmin watch, and that might be interesting if I fall down and bust myself. I can kind of go on the watch and hit a few buttons and call in the cavalry if, I crashed my bicycle or got separated from my backpack on a backpacking adventure where that InReach was sitting. And then the other thing I'd suggest, don't forget the old-fashioned lowly two-way radio, particularly if you're going out in a group. Even if you're in a group of adults or, people that all had cell phones, the cell phone's just not a great way to communicate on an adventure. I think it's good for text messaging, but, having to call people and, having to assemble a group call, I'm successful actually getting multiple people on one phone call about 20% of the time. With the radio, you just hit the side button and it's, hey, I got a flat, hold up, or, hey, I'm hungry, let's stop for lunch. And it's a much easier way to communicate with a larger group. I think there are some, interesting alternatives that combine that location and radio functionality. Probably one of the more mature comes in amateur radio. There's a thing called APRS, where you can send out your position. There's some proprietary manufacturer specific things with some of the amateur radios that will send out your position. And they work pretty well. I've used APRS quite a bit, but the big problem with that is everyone who's on the radio needs to have an amateur radio license. And I could maybe talk the kids into that, maybe get them studied up. It's not simple to pass. But, my wife's a beautiful and understanding human being and has done a lot of stuff related to our adventures and my general low-grade nonsense. But asking her to spend, 3 months studying radio terminology so we can send positions through some convoluted ham radio thing is not going to fly. So that's kind of why I'm a little bit hopeful for this LoRa stuff and this MESHTASTIC application that's behind it. So we'll see how that works. In any event, wish you well on all your adventures. Hope you figure out this comms thing. Hopefully this was helpful. And if nothing else, don't let the comms kind of hold you back from getting out on your own adventures, whether it's a walk around the block or a, bicycle trip around the world. Big Heavy, wishing you bon voyages and good adventuring. Peace.
Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.